choose one fat wife, the other will be executed immediately." The marshal's words cut through Silver Bluff like a blade through flesh. In 30 seconds, a mountain man would have to decide which woman lived and which died. What happened next would shake this dusty frontier town to its very foundations and prove that sometimes love conquers even the cruelest laws. Stay with me until the end of this incredible true story, and don't forget to comment which city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled across our great nation. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on Silver Bluff that fateful September morning in 1887, casting long shadows across the main street where dust devils danced between the weathered storefronts. The town had seen its share of violence, corruption, and heartbreak, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared its residents for what was about to unfold in front of Murphy's General Store. James McGrath stood 6'4" in his worn leather boots, his weathered hands steady despite the impossible choice thrust upon him, his steel-gray eyes hardened by years in the wilderness now held a pain so deep it seemed to cut straight through to his soul. Flanking him were two women who had become his entire world, Maria Santos McGrath and Kesha Freeman McGrath, both bearing his name, both facing death because of a corrupt marshal's twisted sense of justice. "You heard me clear, mountain man." Marshal Silas Drenan spat his badge, glinting maliciously in the harsh sunlight. "The law says a man can only have one wife. You got yourself two fat sows here, and I ain't tolerating such abomination in my town. Choose one, the other hangs at sunset." The crowd that had gathered around the makeshift gallows fell silent as death itself. Shopkeepers peered through dusty windows, children clutched their mothers' skirts, and even the saloon girls had stopped their morning preparations to witness this horrific spectacle. The only sounds were the creaking of the hanging rope in the desert wind and the labored breathing of three people whose lives hung in the balance. Maria Santos McGrath, all 300 pounds of fierce determination, stepped forward first. Her dark eyes blazed with the fire of her Mexican heritage, her thick black hair braided with silver threads that caught the light like armor. She had survived the loss of her first husband, the cruelty of men who saw only her size and not her strength, and the harsh judgment of a society that deemed her unworthy of love. Now facing the possibility of death, she stood taller than ever. "You listen to me, you miserable excuse for a lawman." Maria's voice rang out across the street, rich with the accent of her homeland, but clear as a church bell. "If you think you can break this family with your threats, you don't know what we've already survived." Beside her, Kesha Freeman McGrath trembled slightly. Her pale hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles had gone white. At barely 25, she carried the weight of both physical and emotional scars. Her blonde hair, once golden as prairie wheat, had dulled from years of harsh treatment by men who saw her size as either a joke or an opportunity for cruelty. But in her soft blue eyes burned a quiet strength that had drawn James to her like a moth to flame. "Please," Kesha whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying across the silent street like a prayer, "don't make him choose. We both know what we signed up for when we married him." Marshal Drenan's laugh was as cold as a winter grave. "Signed up? You think this is some kind of business arrangement? This here's about the law, about decency, about keeping this town from becoming a den of moral corruption." He gestured broadly at the crowd. "These good people don't want to see their children exposed to such unnatural arrangements." But James McGrath had heard enough. The mountain man who had spent 5 years in self-imposed exile, who had faced down grizzly bears and survived blizzards that killed lesser men, who had learned to find peace in the absolute solitude of the high country, now faced the greatest challenge of his life. Not the choice between two women he loved, but the choice between accepting injustice and fighting for what was right. "Marshal," James's voice carried the authority of a man who had never backed down from a fight. "You want to talk about law? Let's talk about law." The crowd pressed closer, sensing something momentous was about to happen. Even Drenan seemed caught off guard by the mountain man's sudden shift from desperate husband to something far more dangerous. "I've read your town charter, Drenan. Read it cover to cover when I first brought my wives here 3 months ago. Article 7, Section 3 clearly states that any man of good standing who can provide for his family has the right to establish a household according to his conscience and the laws of God, provided he brings no harm to the community." Drenan's face flushed red. That's an old provision. It don't apply to... It applies to everything. James cut him off, his voice rising with conviction. "And if you want to talk about God's law, then let's bring Reverend Morrison into this conversation." Reverend. From the crowd stepped a tall, thin man in black clothing, his white collar stark against the dust and chaos of the scene. Reverend Thomas Morrison had baptized half the children in Silver Bluff and presided over more weddings and funerals than he cared to count. His face was grave as he approached the gallows. "James," the Reverend said carefully, "what are you asking of me? Tell these people what you told me when I asked you to marry me to both Maria and Kesha. Tell them what the good book says about a man's responsibility to protect the widowed and the vulnerable." Reverend Morrison looked around at the faces surrounding him, faces he had known for years, people he had counseled through their darkest hours. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Jacob had 2 wives, he said simply, Rachel and Leah. Abraham had Sarah and Hagar. David had multiple wives, and Solomon had more wives than any man ought to have." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the crowd. "But in each case, these men were called righteous by God because they took responsibility for these women, provided for them, protected them." Marshal Drenan's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. "Reverend, you're talking about Bible times. This is 1887, and we got laws about..." "Whose laws?" Maria suddenly interjected, her voice cutting through the marshal's protests like a knife through butter. "Your laws, the laws of men who see women like us as nothing more than burdens to be disposed of." She stepped forward, her considerable presence commanding attention from every person in that street. "Let me tell you something about laws, Marshal Drenan. When my first husband, Roberto, died in the mine collapse 3 years ago, your laws said I had 60 days to find another man to marry or lose everything. 60 days to grieve, to figure out how to survive, to find someone willing to take on a fat Mexican widow with nothing to offer but hard work and a stubborn heart." The crowd was absolutely silent now, hanging on every word. "When those 60 days were up, you came to my door yourself, Marshal. You remember what you told me. You said I could marry Jeremiah Hutchins, a man twice my age who already had 2 wives buried in the cemetery and a reputation for working women to death, or I could get out of town. Those were my choices under your precious laws." Kesha found her voice, then stepping forward to stand beside her sister wife. "And when my pa sold me to pay his gambling debts, where were your laws then, Marshal? When Clayton Morse thought he owned me because he paid $50 for my pa's marker, where was the justice in that?" The Marshal's face had gone from red to purple. That's different. Those were private arrangements that your laws allowed," James said, his voice deadly quiet. "Private arrangements that left these women with no protection, no hope, no future except whatever scraps men like you were willing to throw them." He moved to stand between his wives, placing a protective hand on each woman's shoulder. "I didn't come down from those mountains looking for 2 wives. I came down looking for supplies and maybe some human conversation after 5 years of talking to nothing but hawks and coyotes. But I found 2 women who had been broken by your laws, your system, your idea of proper society." The mountain man's eyes swept across the crowd, and many people found they couldn't meet his gaze. Maria was living in a shack behind the livery stable, taking in washing and mending for pennies, slowly starving to death because no respectable man would marry a fat Mexican widow. Kesha was locked in a room above the saloon being used by men who paid Clayton Morse for the privilege, while she got nothing but bruises and shame. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Many had suspected what went on at the Silver Dollar Saloon, but hearing it spoken aloud in broad daylight was shocking even for a frontier town. So yes, Marshal, I married them both. I stood before God and Reverend Morrison and promised to love, honor, and protect both these women until the day I die, and if that makes me a criminal in your eyes, then I'll wear that label with pride. Marshal Drenan was sweating now, despite the desert heat being nothing unusual for September. He could feel the mood of the crowd shifting, could sense that his moment of absolute authority was slipping away like sand through his fingers. The law is the law, he insisted, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. A man can't have two wives. It ain't natural. Natural. Maria laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to talk about what's natural, Marshal? Is it natural for a woman to starve because she's too big for your narrow definition of beauty? Is it natural for a young girl to be sold like cattle to pay her father's debts? Is it natural for men like you to decide who deserves love and who deserves to die alone? She stepped closer to Drenan, her dark eyes blazing with righteous fury. James McGrath is the first man who ever looked at me and saw a woman worth protecting instead of a burden to be endured. He married me not because he had to, not because it was convenient, but because he chose to. He saw worth in me when your natural world had decided I had none. Kesha, emboldened by her sister-wife's courage, found her own voice growing stronger, and he saved me from a life of unspeakable things. He gave me a name, a home, a chance to remember what it feels like to be treated with kindness instead of cruelty. The crowd was murmuring now, voices rising as neighbors turned to each other, discussing what they had heard. James could see the uncertainty in many faces, the dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this situation than simple law-breaking. But Marshal Drenan wasn't finished. His hand was now resting openly on his gun butt, and his deputy, a nervous young man named Tom Bradley, had moved to flank the group with his rifle at the ready. Enough, Drenan shouted. I don't care how pretty you make it sound, McGrath. The fact remains that you're living in sin with two women corrupting the moral fiber of this community and setting an example that could destroy the very foundations of Christian society. He gestured toward the gallows with its waiting noose. Now choose. Choose which one lives and which one dies, or I'll make the choice for you and hang them both. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. James McGrath looked at his two wives, these incredible women who had survived more hardship and cruelty than most men could imagine, who had found the courage to love again, despite everything they had endured, who were now facing death because they had dared to find happiness in an unconventional arrangement. No, he said simply. What? Drenan blinked clearly, not expecting such a response. I said no, Marshal. I won't choose between them because the choice itself is wrong. You're asking me to play God with the lives of two innocent women, and I won't do it. The mountain man's voice grew stronger, more confident with each word. But I'll tell you what I will do. I'll stand trial, right here, right now, in front of these people. Let them decide whether what we've done is so terrible that it deserves death. Reverend Morrison stepped forward. James, that's not how the law works. Isn't it, Reverend? These people are the community. They're the ones who have to live with whatever decision gets made here today. Shouldn't they have a say in it? From somewhere in the crowd, an unexpected voice spoke up. I think they should. All eyes turned to see Martha Hutchins, the wife of the town's banker, pushing her way through the crowd. She was a small, neat woman in her 50s, known for her charity work and her firm moral convictions. Mrs. Hutchins, Marshal Drenan said uncertainly, this isn't a matter for, isn't it? Martha's voice was crisp and clear. Marshal, I've known both these women since they came to town. Maria helped deliver my grandson when the doctor was away on a call. Kesha has been teaching the younger children to read at the Sunday school. These aren't wicked women corrupting our community. They're good women who found love in an unusual place. More voices began to join in from the crowd. "That's right," called out Ben Murphy, the store owner. "Maria's been paying her bills regular-like ever since she married McGrath. Never caused any trouble. And Kesha helped nurse my boy through the fever last month," added Sarah Chen, one of the few Chinese residents of Silver Bluff. "Sat up with him 3 nights running when I thought we were going to lose him." Marshal Drenan looked around frantically as more and more townspeople began speaking up in defense of the unconventional family. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. He had expected to make an example of McGrath, to show the town that moral corruption wouldn't be tolerated. Instead, he was facing something that looked dangerously like a rebellion. "Quiet," he shouted, drawing his gun. "Love you quiet. I don't care what good deeds these women might have done. The law says polygamy is illegal, and I mean to enforce that law." The crowd fell silent again, but the tension in the air was palpable. Hands moved toward concealed weapons. Men stepped protectively in front of their wives and children, and everyone seemed to be waiting for someone to make the first move. It was then that another unexpected voice cut through the tension. "Marshal Drenan." Everyone turned to see Judge Harrison Blackwood, walking slowly down the main street, his black robes billowing in the desert wind. Judge Blackwood was a legend in this part of the territory, a man known for his fairness, his wisdom, and his absolute incorruptibility. He held court in Silver Bluff twice a year, dispensing justice with an even hand that had earned him respect from all corners of society. "Judge Blackwood," Marshal Drenan said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank God you're here. These people are trying to interfere with a lawful execution." Judge Blackwood stopped about 10 feet from the gallows and looked around at the assembled crowd, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of decades of legal experience. "Marshal, by what authority are you conducting an execution without benefit of trial?" Drenan's relief quickly turned to confusion. The law clearly states that polygamy is illegal in the territory of Arizona. These people are in violation of that law." "Indeed, polygamy is illegal," the judge agreed. "But the law also clearly states that accused parties have the right to a trial by a jury of their peers. Where is this jury, Marshal? Where is the formal charging document? Where is the evidence beyond your own testimony?" The marshal's face went pale. "Judge, there wasn't time for all that legal nonsense. The situation required immediate action." "Immediate action?" Judge Blackwood's eyebrows rose. "To prevent what exactly? What immediate danger do these 3 individuals pose to the community that would justify summary execution?" Marshal Drenan looked around desperately, realizing that his moment of absolute power was crumbling before his eyes. They're corrupting the moral fiber of the community, setting a bad example for the children." "I see." Judge Blackwood walked over to where James and his wives stood. "Mr. McGrath, is it?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And these are your wives?" "Yes, sir, Maria Santos McGrath and Kesha Freeman McGrath." "And how long have you been married to these women?" 3 months to both of them, Your Honor. The ceremonies were performed by Reverend Morrison on the same day." Judge Blackwood turned to the Reverend. "Is this true, Reverend Morrison?" The minister nodded. "It is, Judge. I performed both ceremonies after considerable prayer and consultation of the scriptures. While unusual, I found no biblical prohibition against the arrangement, provided all parties entered into it willingly and with full understanding of their commitments." "And did they?" the judge asked, turning back to the wives. Maria stepped forward. "Your Honor, I entered into this marriage of my own free will. James McGrath offered me protection, respect, and love when I had none of those things. I knew he intended to marry Kesha as well, and I supported that decision because I could see that she needed the same protection I did." Kesha nodded, her voice stronger now. with the judge's presence lending legitimacy to the proceedings. I was in a very bad situation, Your Honor. James saved me from that situation and offered me a chance at a real life, a real family. I knew about Maria, and I was grateful to have her as a sister and partner in building that family. Judge Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. Finally, he turned back to Marshal Drenan. Marshal, while polygamy is indeed illegal under territorial law, I see several significant problems with your handling of this case. First, you have failed to follow proper legal procedures. Second, you have threatened summary execution without trial, which is a violation of both territorial and federal law. Third, you have created a public disturbance and endangered the peace of this community. Drenan's hand tightened on his gun. Judge, with all due respect, I was trying to enforce the law. No, Marshal, you were trying to play judge, jury, and executioner. That is not your role. Judge Blackwood's voice hardened. Your role is to arrest suspected lawbreakers and bring them before a court for proper adjudication. The judge looked around at the crowd again. However, this situation presents some unique challenges. The nearest federal courthouse is 3 days' ride from here, and I am not scheduled to return to Silver Bluff for another 6 months. Under the circumstances, I am prepared to convene an immediate hearing to determine the facts of this case. He pointed to the steps of the general store. Mrs. McGrath and Mrs. McGrath, please take seats there. Mr. McGrath, you stand here beside me. Marshal Drenan, you will present your case. Reverend Morrison, I may call upon you to provide testimony regarding the marriages. The crowd began to arrange itself into something resembling a courtroom, with people settling onto whatever seats they could find or claim. The tension was still thick in the air, but the presence of Judge Blackwood had transformed the situation from a lynch mob into something that at least resembled legal proceedings. Now then, Judge Blackwood said once everyone was settled, Marshal Drenan, present your case. Drenan looked around nervously. He had expected this to be a simple matter of enforcing the law, not a complex legal proceeding in front of half the town. Well, Judge, it's simple enough. The law says a man can only have one wife. McGrath here has 2 wives. That makes him a polygamist, which is illegal. And what evidence do you have that these marriages are legitimate? The judge asked. Evidence? They're living together. They call themselves by his name. They share a bed. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably at this last statement, but Judge Blackwood remained unmoved. Marshal, the fact that people live together and share a name does not necessarily constitute legal marriage. Do you have marriage certificates, witnesses to the ceremonies, any legal documentation whatsoever? Marshal Drenan looked around frantically. Reverend Morrison performed the ceremonies. Judge Blackwood turned to the Reverend. Reverend, did you file the appropriate paperwork with the territorial authorities regarding these marriages? Reverend Morrison looked uncomfortable. Well, Judge, that's where things get a bit complicated. When James asked me to perform both ceremonies, I wasn't entirely sure of the legal implications. I performed the religious ceremonies, but I only filed paperwork for one of the marriages with the territorial government. Which marriage did you file? The marriage to Maria Santos. Judge Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. So, according to territorial records, James McGrath is legally married to Maria Santos McGrath, but not to Kesha Freeman McGrath. But they had a ceremony, Marshal Drenan protested. She calls herself by his name. Marshal, the judge said patiently, many people have religious ceremonies that are not legally binding, and many women take the names of men they are not legally married to. Neither of these facts constitutes polygamy under territorial law. A murmur went through the crowd as people began to understand the implications of what the judge was saying. James stepped forward. Your Honor, if I may speak, you may, Mr. McGrath. Your Honor, while it's true that only one of my marriages is legally recognized by the territorial government, I consider myself morally and spiritually married to both women. I have made commitments to both of them, and I intend to honor those commitments regardless of what any court decides." Judge Blackwood studied the mountain man for a long moment. "Mr. McGrath, I appreciate your honesty, but I must advise you that such a statement could be seen as an admission of intent to commit polygamy." "Then so be it, Your Honor. I won't lie about what these women mean to me or about my commitment to them." Maria stood up suddenly. "Your Honor, may I speak?" "You may, Mrs. McGrath." "Your Honor, if it would resolve this situation, I would be willing to dissolve my legal marriage to James so that he could marry Kesha legally instead." A gasp went up from the crowd, and Kesha jumped to her feet. "No, Maria, you can't." "I can and I will, if it means we all get to live," Maria said firmly. "Kesha, you're younger than me. You have more years ahead of you. If one of us has to be legally married to James, it should be you." "That's not how this works," Kesha protested, tears streaming down her face. "We're supposed to be a family, all three of us together." James moved to stand between his wives. "Your Honor, I won't allow either of these women to sacrifice their happiness for the other. If the law says I can only be legally married to one of them, then maybe the law needs to be changed." Judge Blackwood raised his hand for silence. "Mr. McGrath, while I admire your sentiment, changing territorial law is well beyond the scope of this hearing." He paused, thinking. "However, there may be another solution." The crowd leaned forward eagerly. "The territorial law against polygamy specifically prohibits a man from having multiple legal wives. It does not prohibit a man from having, let us call them, household companions or common law arrangements with multiple women, provided that only one such arrangement is formalized through legal marriage." He looked around at the assembled townspeople. "Furthermore, I see no evidence that this arrangement has caused any harm to the community. On the contrary, from what I have heard today, both women have been contributing positively to the life of Silver Bluff." Marshal Drenan's face was getting red again. "Judge, you can't seriously be considering—" "Marshal." Judge Blackwood's voice cut through the protest like a whip crack. "I am considering the facts as they have been presented to me, the applicable law, and the best interests of all parties involved." He turned back to James and his wives. "Mr. McGrath, here is my ruling. Your legal marriage to Maria Santos McGrath is valid and will remain in effect. Your ceremony with Kesha Freeman McGrath, while meaningful from a religious and personal standpoint, has no legal standing under territorial law. Therefore, you are not guilty of polygamy." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Judge Blackwood wasn't finished. "However," he continued, raising his voice to be heard over the celebration, "I must warn you that this situation exists in something of a legal gray area. While you are not currently breaking any territorial laws, you must be extremely careful to avoid any actions that could be construed as attempting to formalize a second legal marriage." He looked directly at Kesha. "Miss Freeman, you are free to live with the McGrath family, to call yourself by their name if you choose, and to participate in their household arrangements. But you must understand that you have no legal rights as a wife under territorial law. You cannot inherit property, you cannot make medical decisions, and you have no legal recourse if the arrangement should dissolve." Kesha nodded, tears of relief streaming down her face. "I understand, Your Honor. I just want to stay with my family." Judge Blackwood smiled slightly. "Then it appears this matter is resolved." He turned to Marshal Drenan. "Marshal, you will take no further action against these individuals unless they actually violate territorial law. Is that understood?" Marshal Drenan looked like he had swallowed something particularly bitter, but he nodded reluctantly. "Understood, Judge." "Furthermore," Judge Blackwood continued, "I want to make it clear to everyone present that summary execution is never appropriate, except in cases of immediate self-defense. Any future attempts to circumvent proper legal procedures will result in federal charges being filed." The marshal's face went pale and he nodded more emphatically. Judge Blackwood looked around at the crowd one final time. "This hearing is concluded. I suggest everyone return to their normal activities, and remember that we are all neighbors here, regardless of our personal arrangements." As the crowd began to disperse, James found himself surrounded by his two wives, all three of them trembling with relief and emotion. They had come within minutes of losing everything, and now they had been given a chance to continue their unconventional but happy life together. "We did it," Kesha whispered, hardly daring to believe it was true. "We're still a family." Maria wrapped her arms around both James and Kesha. "Sí, mi amor, we are still a family." But even as they celebrated their victory, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Marshal Drenan had been humiliated in front of the entire town, and men like that didn't forget such slights. Judge Blackwood wouldn't be around forever to protect them, and there were other forces at work in Silver Bluff forces that had their own reasons for wanting the McGrath family gone. As the three of them walked home through the dusty streets, James's eyes swept constantly over the shadows and doorways, watching for signs of trouble. He had won this battle, but he had a feeling the war was just beginning. The sun was setting over Silver Bluff, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple. In a small house at the edge of town, three people who had found love against all odds were beginning to understand that sometimes the greatest challenges come not from the wilderness or the elements, but from the hearts of men who cannot bear to see others find happiness in unexpected places. The mountain man had made his choice, and it was a choice that would echo through the territory of Arizona for years to come. He had chosen love over law, family over convention, and justice over the easy path of conformity. But in the growing darkness, other men were making their own choices, choices that would test the McGrath family's resolve and determine whether their hard-won happiness could survive in a world that seemed determined to destroy it. The real test was just beginning. The dust had barely settled from Judge Blackwood's departure when the first rock shattered the front window of the McGrath house. Maria jerked awake from an uneasy sleep, her heart hammering as glass fragments scattered across the wooden floor where moonlight had been streaming just moments before. "James," she whispered urgently, shaking her husband's shoulder. "James, wake up." The mountain man was on his feet instantly, years of wilderness survival having honed his reflexes to razor sharpness. In the darkness, he could hear Kesha's frightened whimpering from the small adjoining room they had partitioned off for her privacy. "Stay down," James commanded softly, his hand already reaching for the Winchester rifle he kept beside the bed. "Both of you stay away from the windows." Another rock crashed through what remained of the front window, this one wrapped with a piece of paper. James crawled across the floor and carefully unwrapped the message, squinting to read it by the faint moonlight filtering through the broken glass. "Get out or die. You got 3 days." The words were scrawled in an ugly, harsh handwriting that James didn't recognize, but the message was clear enough. Someone in Silver Bluff wasn't satisfied with Judge Blackwood's ruling, and they were prepared to take matters into their own hands. "What does it say?" Maria asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Even in crisis, she maintained the fierce composure that had helped her survive widowhood and poverty. James crumpled the paper in his fist. "Nothing we didn't expect. Some folks aren't happy about yesterday's proceedings." Kesha appeared in the doorway of her room, wrapped in a thick shawl and trembling slightly. "Are they going to hurt us?" "Not if I can help it," James replied grimly. He moved to the broken window and peered carefully through the darkness, searching for signs of their attackers. The street appeared empty, but that didn't mean much. Men intent on violence had ways of staying hidden. "We can't stay here," Maria said practically, "not with the windows broken and everyone knowing where we live." James nodded reluctantly. He had hoped they could weather the storm of public opinion by simply keeping their heads down and living quietly, but it was becoming clear that some people wouldn't be satisfied with anything less than their complete departure from Silver Bluff. Pack what you can carry, he told his wives. We'll head up to the old mine shack in the hills until things cool down. For how long? Kesha asked, her voice small and frightened. As long as it takes. But even as James spoke those words, he knew it might not be that simple. The old mine shack was barely more than 4 walls, and a roof hardly suitable for 2 women who had already endured more hardship than most people faced in a lifetime. And winter was coming to the high desert, which meant they would need supplies, firewood, and adequate shelter to survive. As his wives hurriedly gathered their few possessions, James found himself thinking about the events of the past few months, trying to understand how their simple desire to build a life together had sparked such hatred and violence. He had met Maria first on a supply run to Silver Bluff back in June. She had been washing clothes behind the livery stable, her strong hands working steadily, despite the obvious poverty of her circumstances. Something about her dignity in the face of hardship had struck him immediately, and he had found himself returning to town more frequently than necessary, always finding excuses to seek her out. Their courtship had been brief, but intense. Maria had been suspicious at first, wondering what a mountain hermit could possibly want with a fat Mexican widow, but James's genuine respect and kindness had gradually worn down her defenses. When he proposed marriage, she had accepted, not out of desperation, but out of a growing certainty that this strange, solitary man understood something about survival and resilience that most people never learned. Kesha had come into their lives almost by accident. James had been in town for his wedding to Maria when he witnessed Clayton Morse dragging a young blonde woman into the Silver Dollar saloon by her hair, the girl's face already bearing the purple marks of recent violence. Something in her terrified blue eyes had reminded him of a wounded animal he had once found in the mountains, and he had acted on impulse. The confrontation with Morse had been brief and decisive. James McGrath might have been a hermit, but 5 years in the wilderness had left him lean, strong, and utterly without fear when it came to protecting the innocent. Morse had ended up unconscious in the street, and Kesha had found herself free for the first time since her father had sold her to pay his gambling debts. But freedom was a luxury that a young woman with no family and no resources could hardly afford in a place like Silver Bluff. James had offered her protection first as a friend, and then as the days passed, and he saw the depth of her pain and the strength of her spirit as something more. The decision to marry both women had not been made lightly. James had spent weeks in prayer and contemplation, knowing that such an arrangement would bring scrutiny and possibly danger, but he had also seen what happened to women like Maria and Kesha when they were left to face the world alone, and he could not bring himself to choose between them when both needed and deserved protection. Now, as they prepared to flee their home in the middle of the night, James wondered if his good intentions had only made their lives more dangerous. "I'm ready," Maria announced, shouldering a pack that contained their few valuable possessions and as much food as she could carry. Kesha nodded, her own bundle much smaller, but including the precious books that James had bought for her when he learned she could read. Despite everything she had endured, she had never lost her love of learning, and James had encouraged her to continue her education whenever possible. "All right," James said, taking one last look around the small house that had briefly been their home. "We'll go out the back way, through the alley. Stay close and stay quiet." They slipped out into the desert night, 3 figures moving like shadows through the empty streets of Silver Bluff. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate by, but also making them visible to anyone who might be watching. James led them through a maze of back alleys and abandoned lots, using every trick he had learned in 5 years of avoiding human contact. The old mine shack was a 2-hour walk up into the hills, following a treacherous path that wound between massive boulders and scraggly desert vegetation. James had discovered it during his first winter in the wilderness, when he had been forced to seek shelter from a particularly vicious blizzard. The mine itself had been abandoned for years, its silver vein played out, and its tunnels now home to nothing but bats and memories. How much farther? Kesha asked. After they had been climbing for over an hour, her breathing labored from the exertion and the altitude. Not much, James replied, though he could see that both women were struggling with the difficult terrain. Maria, despite her size, was actually handling the climb better than Kesha, her years of hard physical labor having given her surprising endurance. When they finally reached the shack, it was even more primitive than James had remembered. The roof leaked in several places, the single room was barely large enough for 3 people, and the stone fireplace looked like it hadn't been used in decades. But it was shelter, and more importantly, it was hidden. "Home, sweet home," Maria said with grim humor, setting down her pack and looking around at their new accommodations. "It's not much," James admitted, "but it's safe, and it's only temporary." "Temporary until what?" Kesha asked, sinking down onto one of the rough wooden crates that served as furniture. "Until the people who hate us decide to leave us alone, until we can go back to pretending that everything is normal." James didn't have a good answer for that question because he was beginning to suspect that things would never be normal for them in Silver Bluff or anywhere else in the territory. Their very existence challenged too many people's ideas about proper society, and some challenges were not easily forgiven or forgotten. "We'll figure it out," he said finally, "one day at a time." But as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the gaps in the shack's walls, James found himself wondering if they would have that luxury. The men who had thrown rocks through their windows were unlikely to be satisfied with simply driving them out of town, and the isolation that had once been James's refuge might now become a trap. The next 3 days passed in uneasy quiet. James made careful trips down to Silver Bluff to gather supplies and information, while Maria and Kesha worked to make the shack more livable. Despite the primitive conditions, or perhaps because of them, the 3 of them grew closer during those long hours of shared hardship. "You know," Maria said one evening as they sat around the small fire James had built in the ancient fireplace, "I never thought I'd say this, but there's something peaceful about being up here, away from all the judging eyes and wagging tongues." Kesha nodded, looking up from the book she had been reading by firelight. "It feels like we can just be ourselves, just be a family without having to explain or justify it to anyone." James smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Maybe that's what we needed. Time to figure out who we are when we're not trying to fit into someone else's idea of normal. But their peaceful interlude was shattered on the 4th day when James returned from a supply run with news that made his blood run cold. "Marshal Drenan is dead," he announced without preamble as he entered the shack. Both women looked up in shock. "Dead?" Maria asked. "How?" "Shot in the back outside the Silver Dollar Saloon last night. Whoever did it left his body in the street and rode out of town before dawn." Kesha's face went pale. "Do they know who?" "They know who they're blaming," James said grimly. "Me." The silence that followed was deafening. Maria was the first to find her voice. "That's impossible. You were here with us all night." "We know that, but no one else does. And apparently several people saw a tall man in buckskins near the saloon around the time Drenan was killed." James sat down heavily on one of the crates, his mind racing through the implications. "There's more. They found a letter in Drenan's pocket, supposedly from me, threatening to kill him if he didn't leave us alone." "But you never wrote any such letter," Kesha protested. "Of course not. But handwriting can be forged, and dead men can't testify about what really happened." Maria stood up and began pacing the small confines of the shack, her mind working furiously. "This is too convenient. Someone wanted Drenan dead and decided to frame you for it at the same time." "But who?" Kesha asked. "And why?" James had been asking himself the same questions during the long ride back from town. "I'm not sure about the who yet, but I think I'm starting to understand the why. Drenan wasn't well liked, but he was useful to certain people. People who benefited from having a corrupt marshal who could be bought or intimidated." He looked at his wives seriously. I think we stumbled into something bigger than just prejudice against our marriage arrangement. I think there are people in Silver Bluff who have been using Drenan to cover up other crimes, and now they need a scapegoat to take the blame for his murder. Maria stopped pacing. So what do? We can't stay hidden up here forever, and we certainly can't go back to town if they think you're a murderer. We need to find out who really killed Drenan, James said, and we need to do it before the territorial marshals arrive to arrest me. How long do we have? Kesha asked. Maybe a week if we're lucky. The nearest federal outpost is 3 days' ride from Silver Bluff, and it'll take time for word to reach them and for them to organize a manhunt. James stood up and moved to the single small window, looking out at the desert landscape that had been his home for so many years. There's something else. Reverend Morrison came to see me today. He said there's been talk about forming a vigilante committee to hunt us down if the federal marshals don't act quickly enough. The implications of that statement hung heavy in the air. Vigilante justice in the territories was often swift, brutal, and completely unconcerned with actual guilt or innocence. We need help, Maria said suddenly. We can't fight this alone. Who's going to help us? Kesha asked bitterly. Half the town thinks we're immoral degenerates, and the other half thinks James is a murderer. Judge Blackwood, Maria said with sudden conviction. He was fair to us before. Maybe he'd be willing to help us again. James shook his head. Judge Blackwood won't be back in Silver Bluff for months, and even if we could reach him, there's no guarantee he'd believe us over the evidence that's been planted. Then what about Reverend Morrison? Kesha suggested. He performed our marriages. He knows we're not the kind of people who would resort to murder. The Reverend's a good man, James agreed, but he's just one voice against a whole town full of suspicion and fear. Maria sat back down, her expression thoughtful. What about the other outcasts? The people in Silver Bluff who know what it's like to be judged and found wanting. James raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I mean Sarah Chen and her family, the Chinese workers who built the railroad but aren't allowed to own property in town. The Mexican families who work the ranches but can't get served in most of the stores. The ex-slaves who came west looking for freedom but found a different kind of prejudice. James began to see where she was going with this. You think they might be willing to help us? I think they might be willing to listen to us at least. And some of them might have seen or heard things that the respectable people in town missed. It was a long shot, but it was also their only shot. James looked at his two wives, these remarkable women who had already shown more courage and resilience than most men he had known. All right, he said finally, but we'll have to be extremely careful. If we're caught sneaking around town, it'll just make things worse. So how do we do this? Kesha asked. James was quiet for a long moment, thinking through the logistics and the risks. We split up. Maria, you know the Mexican families better than anyone. Can you reach out to them without being seen? Maria nodded. See, I know places to meet people who will listen. Kesha, you spent time in the Chinese quarter when you were at the saloon. Do any of them trust you enough to talk? Kesha's face tightened at the reminder of her time as Clayton Morse's prisoner, but she nodded. Sarah Chen always treated me kindly, and her husband Li Wei, he sees everything that happens in this town. If anyone knows who really killed Marshal Drenan, it would be him. Good. I'll try to find out more about Drenan's business dealings, see if I can figure out who might have wanted him dead. Maria reached out and took James's hand. This is dangerous, mi amor. If we're caught, we hang, James finished bluntly. But if we do nothing, we hang anyway. At least this way we have a chance. As the sun set over the desert hills, three unlikely allies prepared to risk everything on a desperate gamble to clear their names and expose the real killers. They had found love against all odds, survived prejudice and persecution, and faced down the corrupt power of Marshal Drenan. Now they faced their greatest test yet. The next morning, James made his way carefully down the hidden paths he had used during his years as a hermit, approaching Silver Bluff from the east, where the morning sun would make him harder to spot against the rocky landscape. His destination was the abandoned mining claim, where he had first built his shelter when he came to the territory, a place where he could observe the town without being seen. From his vantage point, he could see that Silver Bluff was buzzing with activity. Groups of men gathered on street corners, their conversations animated and their gestures aggressive. Outside the general store, a hastily painted sign announced a town meeting for that evening to discuss the McGrath situation. Most ominously, he could see men with rifles patrolling the main street, clearly looking for any sign of his return. But James had not survived 5 years in the wilderness by being careless or impatient. He settled into his hiding place and began the long process of observation, looking for patterns in the movements below, identifying potential allies and enemies, and most importantly, trying to spot anything that might give him a clue about who had really killed Marshal Drenan. What he saw troubled him deeply. The men with rifles were not the usual troublemakers and drifters who might be expected to form a vigilante committee. These were respected businessmen, ranch owners, and civic leaders. Whatever was behind Drenan's murder, it had the backing of Silver Bluff's most powerful citizens. As the day wore on, James began to notice something else. Several well-dressed strangers had arrived in town, men who carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed. They met in small groups with the local leadership, their conversations intense and their manner urgent. Railroad men. James was certain of it. He had seen their type before during his brief time working for the Union Pacific, before he retreated to the mountains. These were the kind of men who bought and sold entire towns, who could make or break communities with a word to the right politicians or investors. But what did railroad interests have to do with Marshal Drenan's death? And more importantly, what did they have to do with the campaign against his family? As evening approached, James carefully made his way to the rendezvous point, where he had arranged to meet his wives. The old Spanish mission, abandoned since the Apache raids of the previous decade, sat on a hill overlooking the town, its crumbling walls providing both shelter and concealment. Maria arrived first, moving through the ruins with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent her childhood playing in similar structures. Her face was grim, but there was a spark of satisfaction in her dark eyes. "I found out some interesting things," she said without preamble. "The Hernandez family has been getting pressure to sell their land to railroad speculators. So has old Miguel Santos and the Gutierrez clan." "What kind of pressure?" James asked. "The kind that comes with threats about what might happen to people who don't cooperate. Miguel's youngest son was beaten up behind the cantina 2 weeks ago. They said it was random violence, but Miguel thinks otherwise." James felt the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. They're trying to buy up all the land around Silver Bluff. See, but not just any land, the good land with water rights and access to the railroad. They want to build something big here, and they don't want to pay fair prices for it. Kesha arrived a few minutes later, breathing hard from her careful journey through the desert scrub. Her news was equally disturbing. "Leeway says Marshal Drenan was taking money from the railroad people," she reported. "But lately he'd been getting greedy, demanding more and more for his cooperation. Leeway heard him arguing with one of the railroad men just last week, saying he knew too much about their business to be treated like a common hireling." "Blackmail," James said grimly. "Drenan was blackmailing the railroad, and they decided he was more trouble than he was worth." "But why frame you for his murder?" Maria asked. "Why not just make it look like a robbery or a drifter passing through?" James thought about that for a moment. "Because framing me serves 2 purposes. It gets rid of Drenan, and it gets rid of us. We've been asking too many questions, drawing too much attention. Some of the things Judge Blackwood said during our hearing probably made the railroad people nervous." "What things?" Kesha asked. He talked about town charters and land rights, about the legal protections for families and property owners. If the railroad is trying to force people off their land through intimidation and corruption, having a federal judge poking around asking questions is the last thing they want. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the implications of what they had discovered. They weren't just fighting prejudice against their unconventional marriage anymore. They were up against powerful financial interests that had already committed murder and framed an innocent man to protect their schemes. "So what do we do now?" Maria asked. "We know the truth, but how do we prove it?" James looked out over the lights of Silver Bluff, twinkling in the desert darkness below. Somewhere in that town was evidence that could clear his name and expose the real criminals. But getting to that evidence would require more courage and cunning than any of them had ever needed before. "We're going to need help," he said finally. "More help than the three of us can provide." "From who?" Kesha asked. James smiled grimly. "From the people the railroad is trying to cheat. The Mexican families, the Chinese workers, the small ranchers who are being pressured to sell. If we can convince them that we're all fighting the same enemy, maybe we can find a way to expose the truth before it's too late." "That's a big if," Maria pointed out. "A lot of those people are more afraid of the railroad than they are angry about being cheated." "Then we'll have to give them a reason to be angry," James said. "And we'll have to show them that sometimes the only way to fight back against corruption is to stand together, no matter how different we might seem on the surface." As they prepared to return to their hiding place in the old mine shack, James found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. A year ago, he had been a hermit, content with his solitude and his simple existence in the mountains. Now he was a wanted man fighting for his life and the lives of the two women he loved, caught up in a conspiracy that reached far beyond the dusty streets of Silver Bluff. But as he looked at Maria and Kesha, at their determination and courage in the face of overwhelming odds, he knew that he wouldn't change any of it. They had found something worth fighting for, something worth risking everything to protect. Now they just had to find a way to survive long enough to see justice done. The real battle was about to begin. The thunder started before dawn on the fifth day, rolling across the desert like the footsteps of angry gods. Maria woke to the sound of rain hammering against the tin roof of the mine shack, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine it was just another storm passing through the territory of Arizona. Then she remembered where they were and why, and the cold reality of their situation settled over her like a burial shroud. "James," she whispered, reaching across the narrow space to where her husband lay on a pile of old blankets. "James, wake up. Something's wrong." The mountain man was instantly alert, his hand moving to the rifle that never left his side. "What is it? Listen." Through the sound of the rain, they could hear something else, the distant rumble of many horses moving fast through the desert, heading straight for the hills where they were hiding. Kesha sat up in her corner of the shack, her blonde hair tousled from sleep, but her blue eyes sharp with fear. "How many do you think?" James moved to the single small window and peered carefully through a gap in the shutters. What he saw made his blood turn to ice water. At least 20 riders were making their way up the treacherous mountain path, their horses picking their way carefully over the rain-slicked rocks. Even through the storm, he could make out the glint of rifle barrels and the purposeful way the men sat their saddles. "Too many," he said grimly, "and they know exactly where they're going." "How is that possible?" Maria demanded, her voice tight with controlled panic. "No one knows about this place except us." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't true. Someone had betrayed them, someone who had known about their hiding place and sold that information to their enemies. "We have to run," Kesha said, already gathering her few possessions. "Right now, before they get here." James shook his head. "There's nowhere to run to. They've got us surrounded, and in this storm, we'd never make it down the backside of the mountain without breaking our necks. "So, what do we do?" Maria asked, though she already knew the answer. They had run out of options, run out of places to hide, run out of time. The only choice left was to make a stand. "We fight," James said simply. "We make them pay for every inch of ground, and maybe, just maybe, we can hold out long enough for help to arrive." "What help?" Kesha asked desperately. "Who even knows we're innocent?" "Reverend Morrison knows," Maria said, checking the loads in the old pistol James had given her. "And some of the Mexican families, they might not be able to stop a lynch mob, but they can spread the word about what really happened here." James was moving quickly around the small shack, positioning their meager supplies to provide the best possible cover. The stone walls were thick enough to stop most rifle bullets, but there were too many windows and openings for them to defend effectively with just 3 people. "Listen to me," he said, his voice calm despite the desperate circumstances. "When the shooting starts, I want both of you to stay low and stay behind the stone walls. Don't try to be heroes. Just stay alive long enough for me to thin out their numbers." "You're not doing this alone," Maria said fiercely. "We're a family. Remember, we stand together or we fall together." "Maria's right," Kesha added, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "I may not be much good with a gun, but I can reload for you while you're shooting." James looked at his 2 wives, these incredible women who had already endured more hardship than most people faced in a lifetime, and felt his heart swell with pride and terror in equal measure. They were about to face almost certain death, but they were facing it together as a family. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this smart. We make them come to us, force them to attack uphill in the rain. Every advantage we can get, we take." The sound of hoofbeats was getting closer now, accompanied by the harsh voices of men who thought they were about to collect an easy bounty. James could make out individual words through the storm: murderer, degenerate. Clean up this territory once and for all. "There," a voice shouted from outside. "That's the shack. Spread out and surround it." James positioned himself at the main window, his Winchester ready. Maria took the smaller window on the east side, while Kesha crouched behind the thick stone wall near the door, ready to pass ammunition and tend to any wounds. "James McGrath," a voice boomed across the rain-soaked mountainside. "This is Deputy Marshal Thomas Crenshaw. You're under arrest for the murder of Marshal Silas Drenan. Come out with your hands up and we'll take you back for a fair trial." James almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A fair trial from men who had hunted them through the desert like animals and surrounded their hiding place in the middle of a thunderstorm. "And if I don't come out," James called back, "then we'll burn you out," Crenshaw replied. "You got women in there with you, McGrath. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Maria caught James's eye and shook her head firmly. They all knew that surrendering meant death just as surely as fighting did. At least this way they had a chance to take some of their enemies with them. "I didn't kill Marshal Drenan," James shouted through the storm, "and I'm not coming out until the real killers are brought to justice." "You had your chance," Crenshaw yelled back. "Boys, light them torches." Through the rain, James could see dark figures moving around the shack, trying to get close enough to set fire to the wooden roof. He drew a careful bead on one of them and squeezed the trigger, the rifle's crack echoing across the mountainside. The man went down hard, and the others scrambled for cover behind the rocks and scraggly trees. "That's one," James muttered, working the lever action to chamber another round. The return fire came immediately, a storm of bullets that splintered the wooden shutters and sent stone chips flying from the walls. Maria waited for a lull in the shooting, then leaned around her window and fired twice with her pistol, forcing 2 more attackers to dive for cover. "I can see them moving on the south side," Kesha called out, peering through a crack in the wall. "3 of them trying to get around behind us." James swung his rifle toward the south window and waited. When the first man's head appeared silhouetted against the gray storm clouds, he didn't hesitate. Another shot, another enemy down, but there were still too many of them, and James could see that they were getting bolder, moving closer to the shack with each passing minute. Worse, the rain was starting to let up, which would make it easier for the attackers to coordinate their assault. "Maria," James called out during a brief lull in the gunfire, "how are you doing on ammunition?" "3 shots left," she replied grimly. "Kesha, what about you?" "I've got maybe a dozen rounds for the rifles, but that's all." James nodded, trying to calculate how long they could hold out against 20 armed men with their limited supplies. The math was not encouraging. That was when they heard the sound that changed everything, more hoofbeats coming fast from the direction of Silver Bluff. But these weren't the measured, purposeful sounds of a hunting party. These were the desperate, urgent sounds of riders pushing their horses to the limit. "What the hell?" Deputy Marshal Crenshaw's voice carried clearly across the mountainside, and James could hear the confusion and alarm in it. Through the storm, a new group of riders was emerging from the desert below. James counted at least 15 of them, and as they drew closer, he could make out details that sent a surge of hope through his chest. These weren't railroad enforcers or territorial marshals. These were the people of Silver Bluff, the Mexican families, the Chinese workers, even some of the white ranchers and shopkeepers who had been getting pressured by the railroad interests. Leading them was an unexpected figure, Judge Harrison Blackwood, his black coat streaming behind him as he rode his horse hard up the treacherous mountain path. "Deputy Marshal Crenshaw," Judge Blackwood's voice boomed across the mountainside with all the authority of federal law. "Stand down immediately. You are acting outside your jurisdiction and in violation of territorial statutes." "Judge Blackwood." Crenshaw's voice was full of confusion and growing panic. "What are you doing here? We have a warrant for McGrath's arrest." "A warrant issued by whom?" the judge demanded, his horse dancing nervously as he brought it to a halt between the two groups of armed men. "By what authority do you pursue a man into the mountains without proper legal process?" James could hardly believe what he was seeing. Somehow, impossibly, help had arrived at the last possible moment, but he could also see that the situation was far from resolved. The men surrounding the shack still outnumbered Judge Blackwood's group, and there was no guarantee that they would back down just because a federal judge had arrived. "We have evidence that McGrath murdered Marshal Drenan," Crenshaw insisted. "Witnesses, physical evidence, fabricated evidence," a new voice interrupted. Li Wei, the Chinese merchant, urged his horse forward, despite the obvious danger. "Evidence created by the same men who have been terrorizing our community for months." "You're out of line, Chinaman," one of Crenshaw's men snarled, swinging his rifle toward Li Wei. "Lower that weapon," Judge Blackwood commanded, his own hand moving to the pistol at his side. "Mr. Li is a respected member of this community and a witness in a federal investigation." "Federal investigation." Crenshaw's voice was getting higher with each exchange, and James could see the deputy marshal looking around frantically, as if searching for an escape route. "That's right," Judge Blackwood said calmly. "An investigation into allegations of railroad corruption, land fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Allegations that have been substantiated by multiple witnesses and documented evidence." From his position in the shack, James could see the effect these words were having on the men surrounding them. Some of Crenshaw's followers were already backing away, clearly having no desire to be caught up in a federal investigation. Others were looking uncertain, as if they were beginning to realize they might be on the wrong side of this fight. But the hardcore group around Crenshaw, the men James recognized as railroad enforcers, weren't backing down. If anything, they seemed to be getting more desperate, more dangerous. "This is all lies and speculation," Crenshaw shouted. "McGrath is a murderer, and these people are interfering with justice." "The only interference with justice here," said another familiar voice, "is the corruption that has been eating away at this community like a cancer." Reverend Morrison rode forward, his normally peaceful demeanor replaced by righteous anger. "Deputy Crenshaw, I've known you since you were a boy attending my Sunday school. Your father was a good man who believed in truth and justice. What would he think of what you've become?" "You stay out of this, preacher," Crenshaw snarled, but James could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "I can't stay out of it," Reverend Morrison replied. "Not when innocent people are being hunted like animals, not when lies are being told in the name of justice." More voices began to join in from Judge Blackwood's group. Miguel Santos spoke in rapid Spanish, his weathered hands gesturing angrily as he described the threats and intimidation his family had endured. Sarah Chen added her own testimony about the pressure being put on the Chinese community to sell their businesses and leave town. But it was Maria who provided the most devastating testimony of all. James watched in amazement as his wife stepped out of the shack, her pistol lowered but still ready, her dark eyes blazing with fury. "You want to know who killed Marshal Drenan?" She called out, her voice carrying clearly across the mountainside. "It was the same men who beat up Miguel's son, who burned down the Hernandez barn, who threatened to kill my husband if we didn't leave town quietly." She walked forward slowly, deliberately, every step radiating the fierce dignity that had first attracted James to her. It was the railroad men who thought they could buy this whole territory for pennies on the dollar, who thought they could murder and terrorize their way to whatever they wanted. "You're lying," Crenshaw shouted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Maria challenged. "Then explain this." She reached into her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is a letter from the Arizona Central Railroad Company offering to buy our land for 10% of its actual value. It came with a very clear message about what would happen to us if we refused." She threw the letter toward Judge Blackwood, who caught it and began reading, his expression growing darker with each line. "This document," the judge said slowly, "explicitly threatens violence against the McGrath family if they do not accept the railroad's offer within 30 days. That proves nothing." Crenshaw insisted, but James could see that more of his men were wavering, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this confrontation was taking. "It proves everything," Judge Blackwood replied. "Combined with the other evidence we've gathered, it establishes a clear pattern of conspiracy, intimidation, and murder." "What other evidence?" Crenshaw demanded. Lee Wei urged his horse forward again. "The evidence I've been collecting for months. Records of payments from the railroad to Marshal Drenan, witnesses to threats against families who wouldn't sell their land, documentation of how the railroad planned to force everyone off their property so they could build their new depot and rail yards. And this," added Reverend Morrison, pulling out his own set of papers, "the real will of Jacob Murphy, who supposedly left his land to the railroad company. The will that was filed with the territorial government is a forgery. The real will leaves Murphy's property to his Mexican common-law wife and their children." James could see the exact moment when Deputy Marshal Crenshaw realized that his position had become untenable. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses were credible, and he was facing a federal judge with the authority to arrest him for conspiracy and murder. But instead of surrendering, Crenshaw made the mistake that desperate men often make. He decided to fight his way out. "I don't care about your evidence," he screamed, raising his rifle toward Judge Blackwood. "McGrath is a murderer, and these people are all lying to protect him." The shot that followed came not from Crenshaw's rifle, but from James's Winchester. The deputy marshal spun around and fell heavily to the ground, his weapon flying from his hands. "That's for Marshal Drenan," James said quietly, working the lever action to chamber another round. "And for all the innocent people you've terrorized in the name of the law." The remaining railroad enforcers looked around frantically, realizing that they were now outnumbered and facing armed men who had every reason to hate them. Some threw down their weapons immediately, while others tried to make a run for it through the rain-soaked desert. Judge Blackwood's voice cut through the chaos like a sword. "Anyone who tries to flee will be hunted down and prosecuted to the full extent of federal law. This conspiracy ends here and now." In the end, most of the survivors surrendered without further bloodshed. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing the prospect of federal prosecution for their crimes. The smart ones recognized when the game was over. As the dust settled and the prisoners were rounded up, James finally allowed himself to believe that their nightmare might actually be coming to an end. He emerged from the shack with Kesha at his side, both of them blinking in the gray light of the storm-washed morning. "How?" he asked Judge Blackwood simply. "How did you know to come here?" The judge smiled grimly. "Your wives weren't the only ones gathering evidence, Mr. McGrath. Reverend Morrison contacted me 3 days ago with some very disturbing allegations about railroad corruption in Silver Bluff. When I arrived in town yesterday, I found a community that was ready to tell the truth about what had been happening here. But how did you know where to find us?" Li Wei answered that question. "My son followed the men who threw rocks through your windows. He saw them meet with railroad agents, heard them planning to frame you for Marshal Drenan's murder. When the posse formed this morning, we knew they were coming after you." Maria stepped forward and embraced Judge Blackwood, impulsively, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for believing in us when no one else would." "Mrs. McGrath," the judge replied gently, "the law is supposed to protect the innocent, not persecute them for being different. I'm sorry it took so long for justice to prevail." As the prisoners were led away and the crowd began to disperse, James found himself standing with his 2 wives on the rain-soaked mountainside, looking down at the town of Silver Bluff spread out below them. The storm was finally passing, and shafts of golden sunlight were beginning to break through the clouds. "So what happens now?" Kesha asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Now we go home," James said simply. "We rebuild our house, we rebuild our lives, and we show this community that love and family can take many different forms." "And the railroad?" Maria asked. "What about their plans for our land?" Judge Blackwood overheard the question and smiled. "The Arizona Central Railroad Company is about to face federal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and murder. I suspect they'll be far too busy defending themselves in court to worry about land acquisition for quite some time." As they made their way down the mountain path, James couldn't help but marvel at the strange turns his life had taken. A year ago, he had been a hermit with no family and no ties to the human community. Now he was part of something larger, something that included not just his 2 wives, but an entire network of people who had been willing to risk everything to stand up for what was right. The real test, he knew, would come in the days and weeks ahead. They had won this battle, but changing hearts and minds would take much longer. There would still be people in Silver Bluff who disapproved of their unconventional marriage, still those who believed that different was dangerous. But as he looked at Maria and Kesha, at their strength and their courage and their unwavering commitment to each other, James knew that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. They had survived persecution, betrayal, and attempted murder. They had proven that love could triumph over hatred, that truth could prevail over lies, that a family was defined not by convention, but by the bonds of loyalty and care that held it together. The storm was over, the sun was shining, and the McGrath family was going home. The journey back to Silver Bluff felt like a procession of the vindicated, but James McGrath knew better than to mistake temporary victory for lasting peace. As their unlikely caravan wound its way down the mountain path, he watched the faces of the townspeople who had risked everything to stand with them, and he saw the same wariness in their eyes that he felt in his own heart. "You're thinking too hard again," Maria observed, riding beside him on one of Judge Blackwood's spare horses. The morning sun had burned away the last of the storm clouds, and her dark hair gleamed like polished obsidian in the desert light. "Someone has to," James replied, though he managed a smile for her benefit. "Just because we exposed the railroad conspiracy doesn't mean everyone in Silver Bluff is suddenly going to welcome us with open arms." Kesha, riding on his other side, nodded gravely. "Some people will always hate us for being different. The question is whether there are enough good people to outweigh the bad ones." Judge Blackwood, overhearing their conversation, guided his horse closer to the family. "That's a fair concern, Mr. McGrath. Change is never easy, especially in a place like Silver Bluff where traditions run deep and suspicions run deeper." "So what do we do?" James asked. "How do we build a life in a town where half the people think we're an abomination?" "The same way you've done everything else," the judge replied with quiet conviction. "One day at a time, with courage and integrity. Let your actions speak louder than their prejudices." As they crested the final hill before Silver Bluff, the full scope of their challenge became clear. The town spread out below them was buzzing with activity, but not all of it looked welcoming. Groups of people clustered in the streets, their animated conversations stopping abruptly when they caught sight of the returning party. Some faces showed curiosity, others relief, but too many displayed the kind of cold hostility that James had learned to recognize during his years in the wilderness. "Look there," Li Wei called out, pointing toward the main street. "Trouble coming." A delegation was forming outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, led by a man James recognized as Jeremiah Hutchins, the banker whose wife had spoken up for them during their first confrontation with Marshal Drenan. But Hutchins himself had always been one of the more conservative voices in Silver Bluff, and his presence at the head of this group didn't bode well. "Judge Blackwood," Hutchins called out as soon as they were within earshot, "I need to speak with you about this situation." The judge dismounted and walked over to meet the banker, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Hutchins, what can I do for you?" "It's not what you can do for me, Judge, it's what you can do for this town." Hutchins gestured broadly at the people gathered behind him. "These folks are concerned about the precedent being set here. If we allow McGrath and his wives to continue their arrangement, what's to stop others from following suit?" James felt Maria tense beside him, and he placed a calming hand on her arm. This was exactly the kind of confrontation he had been dreading, and how they handled it would set the tone for everything that followed. "Mr. Hutchins," Judge Blackwood replied evenly, "the law is quite clear on this matter. Mr. McGrath is legally married to one woman and has a common law arrangement with another. Both situations are well within the bounds of territorial statute." "But is it right?" demanded Sarah Morrison, the minister's sister-in-law. "Is it moral? What kind of example does this set for our children?" Before Judge Blackwood could respond, Reverend Morrison himself stepped forward from their group. "Sarah, perhaps that's a question better directed at the children themselves." He gestured toward a small cluster of young people who had been watching the proceedings with wide eyes. "Tommy Chen, you've been attending Mrs. McGrath's reading lessons at the church. What do you think of her character?" The boy, perhaps 12 years old, looked nervously between the adults before finding his voice. "She's real nice, Reverend Morrison. She helped me with my letters when nobody else would take the time." "And you, Jenny Hernandez," the minister continued. "Mrs. McGrath helped deliver your baby brother last month. What was your impression of her?" The teenage girl blushed, but spoke clearly. "She was gentle and kind, sir. She stayed up all night to make sure Mama and the baby were safe." Jeremiah Hutchins's face was getting red. "That's not the point. The point is that we can't have people flouting the natural order of things just because they've done a few good deeds." "Natural order." Maria's voice cut through the crowd like a blade, and James saw heads turn as she dismounted and walked forward with purposeful strides. "Mr. Hutchins, would you like to tell everyone about the natural order that left me starving behind the livery stable, or maybe you'd prefer to discuss the natural order that had Kesha locked in a room above the saloon being used by men who paid for the privilege?" The banker's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but Maria wasn't finished. "You want to talk about what's right for the children?" she continued, her voice rising with passion. "Let me tell you what's right for children. It's right for them to see that a woman doesn't have to accept abuse just because society says she's worthless. It's right for them to learn that family means people who protect and care for each other no matter what form that family takes." Kesha dismounted and moved to stand beside Maria, her quiet voice somehow carrying just as much power. "Mr. Hutchins, in your natural order, I was property to be bought and sold. In James's family, I'm a person with dignity and worth. Which of those do you think is a better lesson for your children?" The crowd was murmuring now, and James could see that the banker's support was beginning to waver. Several people were nodding in agreement with what Maria and Kesha had said, while others looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "It's not about individual circumstances," Hutchins insisted, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "It's about maintaining the moral foundation of our community." "Mr. Hutchins," Judge Blackwood interjected smoothly, "perhaps we should discuss what truly threatens the moral foundation of a community. Is it 3 people who have committed themselves to loving and protecting each other, or is it corruption, conspiracy, and murder carried out in the name of profit?" The judge's words seemed to hang in the desert air like a challenge. Everyone present knew that the railroad conspiracy had reached deep into Silver Bluff's power structure, that men they had trusted and respected had been willing to commit terrible crimes for money. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, one of the few women in the territory with a medical degree, stepped forward from the crowd. "Judge Blackwood is right. I've seen what real immorality looks like in this town. I've treated women beaten by their husbands, children starved because their fathers spent the food money on gambling, and drink families destroyed by greed and selfishness." She looked directly at the McGrath family. "What I see here is the opposite of that. I see people who have chosen to take responsibility for each other, who have built something positive out of circumstances that could have destroyed them." More voices began to join in creating a debate that split the crowd into increasingly distinct camps. James realized that this confrontation, uncomfortable as it was, might actually be necessary. For too long, the people of Silver Bluff had avoided talking openly about their differences. Now, finally, they were having the conversation that should have happened months ago. "The doctor's right," called out Ben Murphy, the store owner. "I've been watching this family for months now, and I've seen nothing but kindness and hard work. They pay their bills, they help their neighbors, they contribute to the community. What more do you want from people?" "We want them to follow the same rules as everyone else," shouted Clayton Morse, the man who had once held Kesha prisoner. James noticed that Morse was staying well back in the crowd, clearly remembering their previous encounter. "What rules?" Lee Wei demanded, pushing forward despite the obvious hostility some of the crowd directed toward him. "The rules that say Chinese people can't own property in town, the rules that say Mexican families don't deserve fair prices for their land, the rules that let corrupt marshals take bribes from railroad companies." His words hit the crowd like a slap, reminding everyone of the uncomfortable truths that had been exposed during the morning's confrontation. Several people looked ashamed, while others grew even more defensive. "That's different," Hutchins protested weakly. "Those were illegal activities, and what the McGraths are doing is perfectly legal," Judge Blackwood reminded him. "As more than legal, it's admirable. They've taken 3 broken lives and built something strong and loving out of them." Martha Hutchins, the banker's wife, who had spoken up for the family before, finally stepped forward. "Jeremiah, I think you need to stop this. These people have been through enough." Her husband stared at her in shock. "Martha, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've watched Maria McGrath help deliver babies, 10 sick children, and comfort grieving widows. I've seen Kesha McGrath teach reading to children whose own parents can't be bothered to help them with their letters. And I've seen James McGrath risk his life to protect 2 women who had nowhere else to turn." She looked around at the assembled crowd, her voice growing stronger with each word. "If that's immorality, then I'd rather be immoral than whatever it is we've been calling righteous around here." The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice, that of young Tommy Chen, the boy who had spoken up earlier about Maria's reading lessons. "My pa says that family is about people who take care of each other," the child said with the brutal honesty that only children possess. "And that's what they do. So why can't they be a family?" From the mouths of babes James thought watching, as the simple wisdom of a 12-year-old boy cut through all the complicated arguments and moral posturing that the adults had been engaging in. Judge Blackwood seized the moment. I think young Mr. Chen has summarized the situation quite well. This family has proven their commitment to each other and to this community. They deserve our respect, not our persecution. Respect is earned, called out a voice from the back of the crowd, and some things can never be earned back. James turned to see who had spoken and felt his blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the crowd, partially concealed by the shadow of the general store, was a man he recognized from his nightmares. William Crenshaw, the older brother of the deputy marshal, who had led the attack on their mountain hideout. "Well, well," William Crenshaw said, stepping into the sunlight with the lazy confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. "If it isn't the murderer and his whores back to corrupt our town some more." The crowd immediately tensed, sensing the potential for violence. James's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Judge Blackwood raised a warning hand. "Mr. Crenshaw," the judge said carefully, "your brother is currently in federal custody, awaiting trial for conspiracy and attempted murder. I would strongly advise you not to follow in his footsteps." William Crenshaw laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My brother was doing his duty as he saw it, trying to clean up a mess that never should have been allowed to happen in the first place." He stepped closer to the McGrath family, his eyes fixed on James with undisguised hatred. "You killed him, mountain man, shot him down in cold blood while he was trying to serve a legal warrant." "Your brother was trying to murder innocent people," James replied evenly, though his muscles were coiled like springs ready to release. "I did what I had to do to protect my family." "Family," Crenshaw spat. "You call this obscene arrangement a family? You're nothing but a degenerate who couldn't satisfy one woman, so you had to take two." The insult hung in the air like a challenge, and James felt Maria and Kesha move closer to him, presenting a united front against this new threat. "Mr. Crenshaw," Judge Blackwood warned, "you are disrupting a lawful assembly and making threats against federal witnesses. I order you to disperse immediately." "I don't take orders from corrupt judges who protect murderers and degenerates," Crenshaw snarled, "and I don't think the decent people of this town should either." He looked around at the crowd, trying to rally support for his position. "Are we going to let them turn Silver Bluff into some kind of moral cesspool? Are we going to let our children grow up thinking this kind of depravity is normal?" James could see that Crenshaw's words were having an effect on some of the crowd, especially those who had been wavering between acceptance and hostility. Fear was a powerful motivator, and the man was skillfully playing on people's anxieties about change and difference. "He's right," someone called out from the crowd. "This has gone too far. Maybe it's time for decent folk to take a stand." "And what kind of stand would that be?" Dr. Warren demanded, her voice sharp with disgust. "The kind that involves midnight raids and lynch mobs. The kind that lets corrupt officials commit murder in the name of morality." "Sometimes good people have to do unpleasant things to protect their community," Crenshaw replied with chilling calm. "Sometimes the law isn't enough." That was when Maria surprised everyone by stepping forward, walking right up to William Crenshaw, until she was close enough to look him directly in the eye. "You want to talk about protecting the community, senor?" she said, her accent thickening with emotion. "Then tell me how terrorizing innocent families protects anyone. Tell me how turning neighbors against each other makes us stronger." Crenshaw's face twisted with disgust. "Get away from me, you fat Mexican whore!" The slap that followed echoed across the street like a gunshot. Maria's hand moved so fast that most people didn't see it coming, and Crenshaw staggered backward, his hand flying to his reddening cheek. "I am Mrs. Maria Santos McGrath," she said with icy dignity, "and I will not be spoken to that way by anyone, least of all by a coward who sends other men to do his fighting for him." The crowd was dead silent, everyone holding their breath as they waited to see how Crenshaw would respond to such a public humiliation. James's hand was on his gun now, ready to draw if the man made any threatening moves toward his wife. But before Crenshaw could react, another voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Everyone turned to see Reverend Morrison stepping forward, his normally gentle demeanor replaced by something harder and more determined. "Mr. Crenshaw, I've known your family for 20 years, and I baptized your brother when he was a child. But I will not stand here and watch you poison this community with hatred and violence." "Stay out of this, preacher," Crenshaw warned. "This isn't your fight." "It became my fight the moment you started attacking people I've performed marriage ceremonies for," Morrison replied firmly. "These people are members of my congregation, and I will not see them persecuted for living according to their conscience." "Your conscience is as corrupted as theirs," Crenshaw sneered. "No real man of God would sanction this kind of arrangement." Morrison's response surprised everyone. "Mr. Crenshaw, I've spent considerable time studying the scriptures since I performed these marriage ceremonies trying to understand God's will in this matter, and you know what I've discovered." He looked around at the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the authority of years spent in careful study of religious texts. "I've discovered that the Bible is full of unusual family arrangements that God blessed. Abraham had Sarah and Hagar. Jacob had Leah and Rachel. David had multiple wives, and Solomon had more wives than any man could count. In each case, these were righteous men who took responsibility for the women in their care." The minister's words seemed to hit the crowd like a physical force, reminding them that their own religious traditions were more complex than simple moral platitudes. "But more importantly," Morrison continued, "I've seen the fruits of this family's arrangement. I've seen Maria McGrath comfort grieving widows and Kesha McGrath teach children to read. I've seen James McGrath risk his life to protect innocent people from corruption and violence." He fixed his gaze on William Crenshaw. "By their fruits you shall know them, Mr. Crenshaw. And the fruits of this family's love have been nothing but good for this community." Crenshaw's face was red with fury, but he seemed to recognize that he was losing the crowd. Religious authority carried considerable weight in old Silver Bluff, and Morrison's endorsement of the McGrath family was more powerful than any legal ruling. "This isn't over," he snarled, backing away from the confrontation. "There are plenty of good people in this territory who won't stand for this kind of corruption." "Mr. Crenshaw," Judge Blackwood said coldly, "if you or anyone else attempts to take vigilante action against this family, you will face federal charges for conspiracy and domestic terrorism. Is that clear?" Crenshaw didn't answer, but his expression made it clear that the judge's warning had been received. He melted back into the crowd and disappeared, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. Judge Blackwood looked around at the assembled townspeople. "I think we've had enough drama for one day. Mr. and Mrs. McGrath. Mrs. McGrath, I suggest you go home and rest. You've been through an ordeal that would have broken lesser people." As the crowd began to disperse, James found himself surrounded by people offering words of support and encouragement. Ben Murphy promised to extend credit at his store if they needed time to rebuild their finances. Dr. Warren offered her medical services free of charge for the next year. Lee Way and his family invited them to dinner once they were settled back into their home. But it was Martha Hutchins who perhaps offered the most meaningful gesture of all. "Mrs. McGrath," she said to Maria, "I wonder if you would consider joining Our Lady's Auxiliary at the church. We could use someone with your strength and practical experience." Maria's eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. Hutchins, I would be honored." "And Mrs. McGrath," she continued, turning to Kesha, "I understand you've been teaching reading lessons to some of the children. Would you be interested in making that a more formal arrangement? The town could use a proper school teacher." Kesha could barely speak through her emotion. "Yes, ma'am. I would love that more than anything." As they finally made their way back to their damaged house, James felt a complex mixture of hope and wariness. They had won a significant victory today, but William Crenshaw's parting words suggested that their troubles were far from over. There would always be people who couldn't accept their unconventional family, who saw their happiness as somehow threatening to the established order. But as he looked at his two wives, at their strength and resilience and unwavering commitment to each other, James knew that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. They had survived persecution, betrayal, and attempted murder. They had proven that love could triumph over hatred, that truth could prevail over lies, that a family was defined not by convention, but by the bonds of loyalty and care that held it together. The sun was setting over Silver Bluff as they reached their damaged house, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson. The broken windows would need to be repaired, the scattered possessions gathered up and sorted through, but it was still their home, the place where they had chosen to build their life together. "Tomorrow, we start rebuilding," James said, putting his arms around both women as they stood, looking at the work that lay ahead. "Tomorrow," Maria agreed, leaning into his embrace. "Together," Kesha added, her voice strong and certain. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the territory of Arizona, three people who had found love against all odds, prepared to face whatever tomorrow might bring, secure in the knowledge that they would face it as a family. The autumn morning 6 weeks later dawned crisp and clear over Silver Bluff, with the kind of crystalline light that made the desert look like it had been washed clean by angels. James McGrath stood on the porch of their rebuilt home, watching the sun paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and rose, and marveled at how much their world had changed since that terrible night when rocks had shattered their windows and their peace. The house itself was proof of that transformation. Where once had stood a humble structure barely adequate for their needs, now rose a home that spoke of community support and shared labor. Ben Murphy had donated lumber at cost, Lee Way had contributed skilled carpentry work, and even some of the Mexican families had sent their sons to help with the construction. The result was something larger and more beautiful than James had ever dared to dream, with separate bedrooms for privacy, a proper kitchen where Maria could work her culinary magic, and a small library where Kesha could pursue her passion for learning and teaching. "You're up early again," Maria observed, emerging from the kitchen with 2 steaming cups of coffee and the contented smile that had become her trademark since their ordeal ended. "Couldn't sleep," James admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Too much happening today." Today was indeed significant. It marked not only the first official meeting of the Silver Bluff Community Council, of which James had been elected as a representative, but also the opening of Kesha's new schoolhouse and the celebration of what the townspeople had begun calling Reconciliation Day, a commemoration of the community's decision to choose unity over division. "Nervous?" Maria asked, settling into the rocking chair that Reverend Morrison's congregation had given them as a housewarming gift. "Maybe a little," James confessed. "It's strange going from being hunted like an animal to being asked to help govern a community." "Not so strange," Maria replied with characteristic wisdom. "People trust you because you've been tested. They know what you're willing to sacrifice for what's right." Through the morning quiet, they could hear the sounds of Silver Bluff, awakening children's laughter, the clatter of wagon wheels on the main street, the cheerful greetings of neighbors who had learned to see past their differences. It was a sound that James had never expected to hear. Again, the sound of a community at peace with itself. "James, Maria, good morning," called a familiar voice from the street. They looked up to see Dr. Elizabeth Warren approaching their porch, her medical bag in one hand and a basket of what appeared to be fresh bread in the other. Over the past weeks, the doctor had become one of their closest friends and most ardent supporters, using her considerable influence in the community to advocate for tolerance and acceptance. "Dr. Warren," Maria called out warmly, "you're just in time for coffee." and tell me you didn't walk all the way over here just to bring us bread. Actually, I have news, the doctor replied, climbing the porch steps with the energy of someone who had clearly been up all night. Good news, I hope. She settled into the third rocking chair that had appeared on their porch as if by magic, one of many small gifts that had materialized as the community gradually embraced the McGrath family. Judge Blackwood sent word from the territorial capital. Dr. Warren announced without preamble, the railroad trials are over. All the conspirators have been convicted, and the Arizona Central Railroad Company has been ordered to pay restitution to everyone who was cheated or threatened. James felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. What about their land grab schemes? Completely overturned. Every fraudulent purchase has been voided, every forged document exposed. The families who were pressured to sell are getting their property back plus damages. Maria clasped her hands together in delight. What wonderful news. Miguel Santos will be so happy. He's been worried sick about losing his ranch. There's more. Dr. Warren continued, her smile growing broader. The territorial governor is establishing a new law enforcement district for this region with federal oversight to prevent future corruption, and he's asked Judge Blackwood to recommend candidates for the position of district marshal. James raised an eyebrow. Let me guess. Judge Blackwood has someone in mind. He does indeed. Someone with experience in law enforcement, wilderness survival, and protecting innocent people from those who would abuse their power. The implications of what she was saying began to sink in. Dr. Warren, I appreciate the confidence, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to be a lawman. Qualified? Dr. Warren laughed. James, you've single-handedly exposed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. You've protected your family and your community from corrupt officials and violent criminals. If that doesn't qualify you to uphold the law, I don't know what does. Before James could respond, they heard the sound of rapid footsteps approaching the house. Kesha appeared around the corner, practically glowing with excitement and clutching a letter in her hands. James, Maria, you'll never believe what's happened, she called out, hurrying up the porch steps. Good morning to you too, sweetheart, Maria said with amusement. What has you so excited? This? Kesha held up the letter with trembling hands. It's from the Territorial Education Department. They want to make our little schoolhouse an official territorial school with government funding and everything. The news hit them like a thunderbolt. When Kesha had started teaching reading lessons to the local children, it had been an informal arrangement born out of love and necessity. Over the weeks, however, word of her innovative teaching methods and remarkable success with students had spread throughout the territory. Official funding, James asked, still trying to process what this meant. Complete funding. Kesha confirmed, her voice breathless with excitement. Enough to build a proper schoolhouse, buy real textbooks, even hire additional teachers if enrollment grows. Dr. Warren smiled broadly. It seems the territorial government is finally recognizing what we've known all along, that this community has something special to offer. As if summoned by their conversation, more familiar faces began appearing on the street in front of their house. Lee Wei and his family, followed by Miguel Santos and his sons, then Reverend Morrison with several members of his congregation. Soon their front yard was filled with neighbors and friends, all drawn by some invisible signal that something important was happening. What's all the commotion? Asked Martha Hutchins, appearing with her husband in tow. Jeremiah Hutchins had undergone something of a transformation since the confrontation with William Crenshaw, gradually moving from reluctant tolerance to grudging respect to something approaching genuine friendship with the McGrath family. We're celebrating good news, Maria announced, gesturing for everyone to gather closer. The railroad conspirators have been convicted, the families are getting their land back, and Kesha's school is becoming official. A cheer went up from the assembled crowd, followed by a buzz of excited conversation as people shared their own pieces of good news and hope for the future. There's something else. Judge Blackwood's voice cut through the chatter as the man himself appeared at the edge of the crowd, having arrived in town for the community council meeting. The crowd quieted, recognizing the authority in his voice and curious about what other developments he might have to share. "I've just received word from Washington that the territory of Arizona is being considered for statehood," the judge announced. "The federal government wants to establish model communities that demonstrate the values and principles that will guide the new state." He looked directly at the McGrath family. "Silver Bluff has been selected as one of those model communities, largely based on how you've handled the challenges of the past year." The silence that followed was profound. To go from being outcasts and fugitives to being held up as an example of American values seemed almost too incredible to believe. "Judge," James said carefully, "I'm not sure we deserve that kind of recognition." "Mr. McGrath," the judge replied firmly, "you and your family have demonstrated something that Washington desperately wants to see more of: the ability to overcome prejudice, expose corruption, and build unity out of diversity. That's exactly the kind of spirit that will make Arizona a great state." Reverend Morrison stepped forward, his face reflecting the same amazement that James felt. "Judge Blackwood, what exactly does this mean for Silver Bluff?" "It means federal investment in infrastructure, education, and economic development. It means recognition as a community that other territories can learn from. Most importantly, it means that the struggles you've faced here haven't been in vain. They've been the growing pains of a community learning to live up to its highest ideals." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but James found himself thinking about the cost of that recognition. They had paid for their success with blood, terror, and months of uncertainty. Good people had died, families had been torn apart, and the scars of that conflict would take years to fully heal. But as he looked around at the faces surrounding him, faces that reflected every ethnicity and background represented in the American West, he began to understand what Judge Blackwood meant. They hadn't just survived their trials, they had emerged stronger, more united, and more committed to the principles of justice and equality that defined the American dream. "James," Maria said softly, taking his hand, "you're thinking too hard again." "Just trying to understand how we got here," he replied. "A year ago I was a hermit who wanted nothing to do with human society. Now I'm supposedly a model citizen of a model community." "You got here the same way we all did," Kesha observed, joining them at the center of the crowd. "By choosing love over fear, truth over convenience, and courage over comfort." Li Wei nodded approvingly. "Ancient Chinese proverb says that the strongest trees are those that bend in the storm but do not break. This community has learned to bend without breaking." Dr. Warren raised her coffee cup in an impromptu toast. "To the McGrath family, who taught us all that family isn't about conforming to other people's expectations. It's about choosing to stand together no matter what the world throws at you." The toast was echoed by dozens of voices, and James felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. These people, these friends and neighbors who had once viewed his family with suspicion and fear, were now celebrating them as heroes. "Speech, speech," someone called out from the back of the crowd, and the cry was quickly taken up by others. James looked around at the expectant faces, trying to find words adequate to the moment. Finally, he stepped forward, still holding Maria's hand, while Kesha moved to stand beside them. "A year ago," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd, "I thought I knew what family meant. I thought it meant blood relations, traditional arrangements, conventional expectations." He paused, looking at his two wives. "These women taught me that family means something much deeper than that. Family means people who choose to love and protect each other, regardless of what the world thinks about that choice." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "But this community has taught me something even more important," James continued. "It's taught me that the principles that make a family strong are the same principles that make a community strong. Loyalty, sacrifice, acceptance, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. His voice grew stronger as he found his rhythm. We've all made mistakes this past year. We've all had moments when fear made us say or do things we regret. But we've also learned that it's possible to change, to grow, to become better than we were. That's what America is supposed to be about, Martha Hutchins called out, surprising everyone with the passion in her voice. The chance to start over, to build something better than what came before. Exactly, James agreed. And that's what we've done here in Silver Bluff. We've built something better. Not perfect, we're all still human, still flawed, but better. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing hope and determination where once there had been suspicion and fear. Judge Blackwood talks about us being a model community, and maybe we are, but if we are, it's not because we avoided problems or conflict. It's because we faced our problems honestly and found ways to overcome them together. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. So whether Arizona becomes a state next year or 10 years from now, whether Silver Bluff grows into a great city or remains a small desert town, I know one thing for certain. James concluded, his voice ringing with conviction. We've proven that people from different backgrounds with different beliefs and different ways of life can choose to build something beautiful together. The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing off the buildings and seeming to shake the very desert itself. But James barely heard it because he was looking at Maria and Kesha, at the tears of joy streaming down their faces, and thinking about how far they had all come from that terrible morning when Marshal Drenan had demanded that he choose between them. As the crowd began to disperse and people headed off to their various morning activities, the three of them remained on their porch, savoring the quiet aftermath of celebration.
So,
Maria said eventually, are you going to accept Judge Blackwood's offer to become district marshal? James considered the question carefully. The idea of becoming a lawman still seemed surreal, but he could see the logic in it. Who better to enforce justice than someone who had experienced injustice firsthand? I think I am, he said finally, but only if you both support the decision. A marshal's wife faces dangers and responsibilities that most women never have to deal with. Wives, Kesha corrected with a smile. A marshal's wives. And yes, we support you completely. Besides, Maria added with a mischievous grin, who's going to argue with a law officer who has two women backing him up? As the sun climbed higher into the desert sky, painting Silver Bluff in the warm colors of a new day, James McGrath found himself thinking about all the paths his life might have taken. He could have remained a hermit, safe and solitary in his mountain refuge. He could have chosen just one woman to marry following conventional expectations. He could have backed down when faced with prejudice and persecution, taking the easy path of conformity. Instead, he had chosen love over safety, courage over comfort, and justice over convenience. That choice had led him through danger and despair, through moments when death seemed certain and hope seemed lost. But it had also led him here to this porch, with these women in this community that had learned to embrace difference rather than fear it. No regrets? Kesha asked softly, as if reading his thoughts. James looked at his two wives, at their strength and beauty and unwavering commitment to each other and to him. He thought about the children Kesha would teach the families Maria would help heal, the justice he would uphold as marshal of this new district. He thought about the community they had helped build, the precedent they had set, the future they had made possible. No regrets, he said firmly. Not a single one. And as the desert wind carried the sounds of a thriving community across the landscape of the Arizona territory, three people who had defied convention, survived persecution, and found love against all odds settled into their rocking chairs to watch the world they had helped create continue to grow and flourish around them. The mountain man had made his choice, and that choice had changed everything, not just for his unconventional family, but for an entire community learning to live up to its highest ideals. In choosing love over law, courage over conformity, and justice over convenience, James McGrath had proven that sometimes the greatest act of patriotism is refusing to accept the world as it is and insisting on making it what it should be.